Fast forward now to the next morning. I wake up, it's like 10 a.m. I'm naked on the couch, no pants, no cell phone, no wallet, no wife.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm in pain. So I'm like, okay, how do I piece this together?
Remember when we first met John McClane? Argyle picked him up from the plane and took him down the Nakatomi Tower at the Christmas party. And the terrorists were overzealous, but it was sweet when they killed Ellis. And with a little help from Alan, John McClane kicked ass.
Welcome back to Shat the Movies, the podcast where we answer the question, were the movies we loved when we were growing up really that good? Have you ever caught yourself thinking, why don't they make movies like they used to? Can you still remember spending your Friday night searching for the perfect movie rental at Blockbuster Video? Do you know what Blockbuster Video is? If you answered yes, then this is the podcast for you. I'm one of your hosts, Gene Lyons, and alongside me are my co-hosts, Ashley Schlafly.
Hi, y'all.
And Big D, Dick Ebert.
Good evening.
And each week, we take a look back in time and decide if our favorite movies still hold up. The movies we cover are chosen by you, the listeners, who generously commission the films you love. If you'd like to see all the movies we've covered, will cover, or want to choose one for yourself, please visit shatthemovies.com and have a look. At the end of each podcast, we'll provide you, the audience, with the number of wipes each movie would take to get off your respective butts. So thank you so much for listening. If you have not already, hit that subscribe button and share with a friend. It's how we help the podcast grow. Additionally, please subscribe to our sister podcast, Shat on TV. We review TV series such as Westworld, Taboo, American Gods, Game of Thrones, True Detective, Watchmen, and we currently are in the middle of doing Lovecraft Country. You can find out all that information and hear past episodes at shatontv.com. Finally, you can hang out with us live all week long by following and subscribing to our Twitch channel, shatthemovies.com Twitch, where we play video games, host watch parties, and end each and every week with a Shappy Hour cocktail party just for you. All that being said, Big D, what movie are we reviewing today?
Before I get to the movie that we're doing tonight, I just want to thank all of our listeners. We've gotten a bunch of new commissions coming up. So everybody who continues to support the podcast, it means a lot to us. So if there's a movie that means something to you, you have a big, let's just say a moment, a holiday coming up, a wedding, an anniversary, a bar mitzvah, something like that, shoot us an email. It's kind of fun because you put the money away and then one day, poof, your movie appears. So that's what happened for one of our listeners, and this was Kip S. So he commissioned the 1998 psychedelic satirical black comedy road film, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas.
Yeah, so Kip writes, to the entire Shat crew, thank you again for taking a drug-fueled road trip down the memory highway with me and agreeing to do Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. I've been a fan of the Shat on Entertainment family of podcasts for years now, having first discovered you during Season 2 of Westworld. As I write this, we are 4 episodes into Westworld Season 3, and I am very much enjoying both the show and your take on it. It would be tough to overstate the effect this movie and the literature behind it have had on my life. I first saw it at my high school girlfriend's house in my mid-teens, which would have been in the early 2000s. By that age, I had decided I wanted to be a writer. And it was also right about the time I'd started going to parties and experimenting with illicit substances on weekends. So the idea of loading up a convertible with drugs and alcohol and tearing down the highway to Las Vegas definitely piqued my interest. I watched the movie a few more times immediately after that first viewing, then dove headfirst into an odyssey of Hunter S. Thompson's writing. I hope you all enjoy the movie, though I'll be just as interested and satisfied if you passionately do not. I don't see anyone being lukewarm on this movie. I think we in the listening audience will all enjoy the roadshow regardless. And if I can add a touch of reality, as I write this, we are at the beginning of April and a few weeks into the COVID-19 pandemic here in the U.S., and there is definitely a surreal feeling in writing for something scheduled to come out in August. I can't help but wonder what the world will look like in those few very short but probably long-feeling months. This will be a bright spot on the horizon for me. Stay safe and healthy, everyone. Sincerely, Kip. P.S. If I don't hear the usual suspects soon, I may have to commission that too, which I would be equally excited to hear, but also more nervous about.
Well, Kip, newsflash, we fucked up. It's August and shit's not better, man.
It's the same.
So I just had this conversation with my mom. She's been traveling now. She went to Vegas. She went to appropriately, she went to Vegas. She just went to LA. And I'm like, Mom, what the fuck are you doing? You're getting in airplanes. This is insane. And she's like, well, I mean, back in April, things were much worse. No, they fucking weren't. This is it, guys. This is the worst it's going to get. Hopefully.
Yeah, we'll see. I'm still ready to maraud.
Well, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas is, as you mentioned, Big D, a 1998 psychedelic, satirical black comedy road film adapted from Hunter S. Thompson's 1971 novel, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. It was co-written and directed by Terry Gilliam and stars Johnny Depp and Benicio Del Toro. The film details the duo's journey through Las Vegas as their initial journalistic intentions devolve into an exploration of the city under the influence of psychoactive substances. The film received mixed reviews from critics and was a financial failure, but has since become a cult classic among film fans. It grossed $10 million, well below its budget of $18.5 million. Now, Kip was a teenager in the mid-2000s when he saw this movie. Guys, I sometimes feel very old when people write in here. I saw this movie in college. I've only seen this movie on drugs. One time it was on ecstasy. Once it was on shrooms. I liked it both times. But my drug-fueled film consumption usually happened in a house with a half a dozen other people who also were on drugs, wandering between rooms. We were dancing, we were online, we were watching the movie, we were drinking Gatorade, we were digging holes in the backyard. And surprisingly, I remembered pretty much every scene. But I was wondering, for you guys, what are your memories of this movie, or when's the first time you saw it?
So I think I've talked about it plenty in the podcast that during college, I had some moments of experimentation, of mind altering. I mean, I did way too many hallucinogens. They were my favorites. But about this time when the movie came out was right when I was about to join the Army. So it was at the end of my drug use phase. So I would have bet you, though, that I had seen this. I saw the posters. I was like, oh, yeah, I know what this is. About 4 minutes into it, I'm like, okay, I have not seen Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. It must have been Natural Born Killers that I'm confusing it with. And just like having some kind of a flashback, I'm putting scenes together. As soon as they get to the bike race, I'm like, I've never seen this. Never seen it. And it was probably for the better, because if I was doing this on drugs, I don't think it would have been a good day.
Yeah, I was like Eugene. I was also in college the first time I saw this. So I guess it was maybe 2002, 2003. And I'll say at that point, I really just didn't get it. This is a movie I've always thought I really didn't like. And so when I heard we were doing it, I kind of was like, oh, okay, well, I guess I'm watching this again. Because I just remember feeling super overwhelmed by the movie and like the pacing and these really frenetic performances. And it just wasn't my thing. But fast forward to about 20 years later, and I am married now to a recovering addict that I've nursed through 3 really fucking terrible relapses. And so I have a much different outlook on drugs now and have watched this movie with him. And I have to say, I got this movie a lot more this time around. It was a completely different experience. And I'm really grateful to Kip that you commissioned this film, because this is a movie I think I would have just written off that may go into like the upper echelon of like my favorite films from the 90s.
Wow.
And looking at the notes as we prepare for this week, I was astonished by how much everyone had to say about it. It's a movie that a lot of people think might be like repetitive or kind of a one-note film, but we have lots to say about it. So we don't want to spend too much time in the build-up to the movie. We should just get right to it. So Big D, if you wouldn't mind, let's roll that trailer.
They want me to go to Las Vegas at once. As your attorney, I advise you to rent a very fast car with no top. Tape recorder for special music. Get the hell out of LA for at least 48 hours.
We're all set. If I could just get you John Hancock, you're on your way.
Yeah.
Listen, you're going to be real careful with this car, right?
Oh, yeah, man.
Let's give the boy a lift. We can't stop here. This is bat country.
Hot damn, I never rode a convertible before.
Get in.
Hey, for the ride.
You can't park your car here.
Why not? Is this not a reasonable place to park?
Reasonable, you're on a sidewalk.
Fire! What's the score here?
Lucy paints portraits of Barbara Streisand.
God bless.
Hell, look what you're doing to your car! Someone should stop them!
Police, are you people crazy?
What are we doing out here on this godforsaken road? The Emperor's over there, man. I've never missed a plane yet.
Universal Pictures presents the story that defined a generation. Johnny Depp.
Hey, morning, how are you?
Benicio Del Toro.
Let's get down to brass tacks here. How much for the 8?
Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. A Terry Gilliam film.
All right, now I've got to go.
Let's have lunch! Radio, man, radio.
Well, in 1971, Raoul Duke and Dr. Gonzo speed across the desert on drugs. They pick up a young hitchhiker and explain they're covering a motorcycle race in Las Vegas. The hitchhiker flees, and Duke and Gonzo try to reach Vegas before the hitchhiker can go to the police. By the time they reach the Strip, Duke is in the full throes of a sunshine acid trip and barely makes it through the hotel check-in, hallucinating that the clerk is a moray eel and that his fellow bar patrons are orgiastic lizards. So guys, it's no mystery that the movie is a semi-autobiographical, if not autobiographical, tale by Hunter S. Thompson. And so we really should go to him for a judgment on whether Johnny Depp's portrayal was accurate. And Thompson said that Depp's narration, quote, is really what held the film together. And if you hadn't had that, it would have just been a series of wild scenes. And this sums up my take on Johnny Depp's performance perfectly. According to Gilliam, the director, Hunter S. Thompson, while watching this movie, watching his life acted out before him, was watching the premiere. He was having flashbacks. He was jumping around, yelling about bats. And a lot of work went into this. And we talk about method acting. We talk about living in the skin of the person that you're covering. Depp actually lived at Thompson's house. He drove his car. He dug through his artifacts. And he was handpicked among several other actors over several eras. At points, Jack Nicholson was considered for the role, Dan Aykroyd, and also John Cusack over the years. And John Cusack actually was involved with like a stage production of this. But, you know, as people say Depp was or wasn't the right guy for the role, I can't think of anybody more perfect.
I'll say he definitely nails Thompson to a T in these voiceovers. If anybody's ever read Hunter S. Thompson, he's got a very unique style of writing, and it's almost impossible to translate that to the screen. If you're not familiar with him, his writing's kind of this weird mishmash of journalism and memoir and metaphor and political and social commentaries and the counterculture with a little confusion and cynicism and hilarity all thrown in and wrapped up together. It's very difficult to read and understand the first time through. It's something that you have to kind of go back and look at again and again. And I think that's why this movie from the get-go feels really strange for some people, and that it never really reaches some people, because they actually used about 50%, if not more, of the dialogue in this comes directly from Thompson's book. They said, I read an interview with Gilliam where he said, we couldn't write it better than he could. So they just took these huge chunks out and stuck them in. And so I understand why, if you've not read the source material, you may be kind of like, what the fuck when this movie opens up. But Johnny Depp definitely gets it completely right in the way that Thompson writes and the way that he speaks. And I think it's really fascinating.
And when people talk about the source material not translating well to screen, I think one great example of that is Kurt Vonnegut. Like Kurt Vonnegut, amazing author. Every time they try to do a screen adaptation, it's terrible. Like Bruce Willis in Breakfast of Champions, my God, the worst.
Normally, like, constant narration would drive me fucking nuts. Throughout the whole movie, there's no way you could do it. But I found myself enjoying the unconventional way that he writes and talks. It made me wish that I was a better writer, because there's an artistry to it, and he's painting a picture. So to anyone out there who has not done any kind of hard drugs, hallucinogens, the way he talks is the way you think when you're high.
Yes.
So when he's describing crazy fucking scenes, that is the way it appears to you and the way the surroundings and situation is. So he's verbalizing what you see better than anything they do on screen.
Absolutely. But I will say that while I'm going to prepare yourselves, I'm going to do a lot of loving on this movie throughout this podcast. But one thing that I think visually does not work are these weird guest appearances, these weird celebrity cameos that start from the get-go in the movie. If you've not seen it before, it's worth at least looking up the sweaty and balding Tobey Maguire, GIFs that exist out there, because this guy looks really, really strange in this movie. And you're totally distracted, or at least I was totally distracted by going, is that Tobey Maguire? And then trying to figure out if it's a hairpiece and trying to figure out why he's so sweaty. And I think today in 2020, we can pretty much call this like the Ed Sheeran effect from Game of Thrones, where it was so distracting to have this cameo from this actor or the singer, and it just made no sense while he was there. I think that all the cameos in this movie, including Maguire's, just don't work. Thompson makes a cameo of his own, that's fine. But, you've got Cameron Diaz and you've got Christina Ricci and you've got Penn from Penn and Teller, or is it Teller? I can never remember which one
is Penn.
Penn.
Yeah, so Penn. I don't ever know which one is which. But so you've got Penn in there. And I think that it's weird, like these kind of bit performances that they're doing, because you've already got so much going on with the drugs and the hallucinations and the outfits. And it's just a lot to have to also go, wait, who is that? And I think that happens a lot. And it took me kind of out of this beginning scene.
But Ash, you can't put those all in the same class. Like, there are distractions like Gary Busey and Lyle Lovett. There are arguably pretty good performances by Christina Ricci. And then there's just the insufferable Penn Jillette. He's in that circus scene. I wanted to punch through the fucking TV screen.
But dude, what the problem is, the cameos, they detract from the movie. You spend this first 30 minutes getting us into this crazy ass drug fueled where it's acceptable to wave a gun around, to start fucking huffing ether and snorting coke and doing all this shit in a convertible. And then you pull one of these celebrity cameos out, and instead of me thinking about the movie, I'm like, oh shit, look, there's Gary Busey. Oh shit, there's that guy from CIS whatever. You shouldn't do that.
Christopher Maloney.
Yes, because at this point, even though he was great, at this point, I'm forgetting it's Johnny Depp. I've bought in. This is Hunter. And now all of a sudden, I'm like, oh, there's fucking Penn. I wonder where Teller is. I shouldn't be thinking that in the middle of a scene.
But thankfully, they give us one person you can't take your eyes off of, which is fat Benicio Del Toro. Benicio Del Toro is a fucking animal during this movie.
Yes.
The noises he's making, the way he's moving, this guy gained 40 pounds for the role of Dr. Gonzo by eating 16 donuts a day. And then much like Johnny Depp, he was like, okay, who's Dr. Gonzo based on? And it's thought that he's based on Oscar Zeta Acosta, who disappeared in 1974. This guy was a lawyer. He was in trouble with the Bar Association. And according to, several people who knew him and who partied with him, say that this role that he's playing, Benicio Del Toro, Dr. Gonzo, the real Dr. Gonzo, actually partied harder than this.
Yeah, and he's absolutely unrecognizable. And I think Benicio Del Toro, I've had many a sex dream about him. I think he's a beautiful, beautiful man. But he's a fucking beast in this movie. And I think that he's an actor that I sometimes forget how good of an actor he is, because he allows himself to just kind of sink into the background of movies like Usual Suspects, even the cameo he does in, Guardians of the Galaxy. He really is okay with just, embracing these tiny roles or these supporting roles. And man, he is at the top of his fucking game in 1998 in this.
He buys into it. I wouldn't be surprised if this was like a Heath Ledger situation where Benicio was doing crazy drugs, because it seemed genuine. And I think when you're ever going to go into like this type of thing, like they're doing, they're going into Vegas, you have to be so out of your fucking mind. Today as an adult, I can't imagine the shit I used to do tripping out. I can't, because now I'm more like, because now I have a family. Now I'm an adult. But when you're younger, this shit I think back on that I did. I can remember doing a whole lot of acid and going to Six Flags in New Jersey. I couldn't do that shit now. It was New Year's Eve, and three of us said, hey, let's do some more acid and go to New Year's Eve party down by Times Square. A friend had rented a bar. Problem is, we got into the city. We couldn't remember the name of the bar. So we walked up and down the street. We ended up spending the night wandering around Times Square, tripping on acid. It was crazy, but they were good times. We used to smoke a lot of pot and go to the Hayden Planetarium in the city. They would do this whole presentation, like Time to Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon. It was awesome. It was great. It was a lot of fun. But then I'm thinking about shit that I could have gotten arrested. We went to the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum in D.C., tripping on mushrooms. So imagine me, two of my friends. I know we were wandering around the exhibits like Gonzo and Raoul were when they're trying to get into that one casino. That's us. You can only do that when you're carefree and you don't have much to lose. The idea of me going to Vegas and tripping out right now, I cannot even conceive of that.
What's weird, Big D, is the like roller coasters and shit at Six Flags. That wouldn't bother me that much. Being in a museum wouldn't bother me that much. My thing was I cannot be standing in line while I'm on drugs. It is the fucking worst.
Yeah, so I have only been to Vegas twice. I think there's this thing with people from New Orleans, like we don't go to Vegas often because Vegas seems like a really expensive, like overpriced New Orleans. And so I've only been twice, but it was super overwhelming. But you guys are talking about all the drugs. I mean, I'm kind of like a square when it comes to drugs because I really don't like to not be in control of my body. So I love to drink, but like doing drugs, I mean, I've smoked weed twice and had panic attacks and threw up. So not a good look for me, which is the greatest irony that I married who I married because he is like, you know, one of the biggest drug addicts that exists. He's in recovery now, but I am watching this with him. What I love about it is he talks about how accurate aspects of this movie are. So like when they open their trunk at the very beginning, you see that huge suitcase that's full of drugs and he goes through the mescaline and he goes through this and he goes through that. And he has all these things there ready for them to use all weekend. I mean, Tom used to do that too. He called it his felony bag because if he got caught with it, he'd be charged with at least 4 to 5 felonies. And it was filled with heroin and crack and pills and, you know, all the things he needed to use it. Wow. And Depp says in the movie, he says, not that you need all that for this trip, but like it's good to have. And so Tom would literally just like reach down and touch it and feel it, like to make himself feel better, like that he had it all there. And what's really funny is that when he was arrested in 2010 for drinking and driving, he got that removed if he went to rehab. And so he did, and that's how he got clean. But they searched his entire fucking car, and that felony bag was sitting there like in like the pocket of his car, and like they never found it. And that's why I guess like we're together today because he didn't, you know, go to jail to prison for like the next 20 fucking years.
So really it was a marriage made by cops. That's kind of cool, Ash. It's very romantic. You know, you mentioned you are such a square with drugs. I am a massive square. Now I like doing them, but carrying drugs like in that suitcase, no. Anytime I've scored drugs for someone else, I've been sweating bullets. So I've carried weed, acid, ecstasy, shrooms, and like coke in tiny amounts. Never like heroin or crack or anything like that. But there was one time where a certain friend of ours had like a pound of weed that he needed me to store in my apartment. And in my head, every night when I went to sleep, I was like, the feds are going to come fucking crashing through the window. They're going to kick the doors down. You know, they're going to take all this weed. And I just don't know how anyone could get through a day at home, much less a road trip while checking into a hotel with that much on them.
Again, you got to be carefree and stupid. I told the story about going to Canada with like half a pound of mushrooms hidden in the fog lights of my Jeep. And we got pulled over because we were going to a fraternity convention. I was lucky that we didn't get caught, and we should have. But again, you're not thinking straight because people get caught every fucking day. Every single day. Just takes out one fucking mistake.
What the fuck is a fraternity convention?
Oh, it was like a national, it's almost like, you know, how they have the district attorney convention in Los Angeles in 1971. Yeah. It's like that. It's where the fraternity members from around the country get together. So it was in Toronto. So we thought it'd be a great idea because we love tripping balls that why don't we pack some in there? We could sell them, cover part of the trip. Got real lucky they didn't find it, which they should have. It was the last time that I couriered drugs across international borders.
I think it's a good choice, Big D. Well, Duke arrives at the race and heads out with his photographer, Lacerda. Duke hallucinates that they are in the middle of a battlefield, so he fires Lacerda and returns to the hotel. After consuming mescaline and huffing ether, Duke and Gonzo arrive at the Bazooko Circus casino and freak out. Duke leaves Gonzo unattended in their hotel room and returns to find the room trashed. Gonzo is high and pleads with Duke to throw the tape player into the water when the song White Rabbit peaks. Duke instead throws a grapefruit at Gonzo's head before running outside and locking Gonzo in the bathroom. Duke attempts to type his reminiscences on hippie culture, and he flashes back to San Francisco, where a hippie licks spilled LSD off his sleeve.
So this part of the movie has some of my favorite scenes where they're at the race in the desert. I think it really captures most accurately, if you read the book, what Thompson does in his writing. And I know that grown, this is a cliche, where the book is better than the movie in a lot of ways, is in the scenes like this. And a lot of people, they'll watch this movie and they'll say, my God, this guy's like the worst reporter ever. And Rolling Stone in real life certainly thought he was, because they never published the article that he wrote covering this race. But I personally don't think he is. I think that this style of journalism, so he developed it, it's called Gonzo journalism. I think it's really interesting, and I think it's incredibly meta, where he's putting himself in the story on a bunch of fucking hallucinogens. And on top of that, you create this whole new way of storytelling and possibility, because you are part of the narrative and you're telling it from kind of like this third person perspective because you are high. And I think that the voiceover in the scene, I think it captures that really well. And I couldn't stop laughing at him trying to keep his beer safe too. I mean, I respect, that commitment, but I think the whole thing was fantastic, this whole interlude.
Big D, you mentioned it earlier in the podcast, that boosts your inner monologue that you get from drugs. That is my favorite part of doing drugs. I feel superhuman in my, mental faculties. Like, things are just firing up there. Everything's going on. And at least with my drugs of choice. And, as a writer, Ash, I think you can appreciate this, that the worst condition is when you sit down and you've got nothing to write, when you hit that writer's block. If I could just trip anytime I got stuck, I would, write all day. And that brings me to that idea of deprogramming the mind. Again, talk about cliches when it comes to hallucinogens and drugs. But, much like they say, like acid deprograms your mind, this movie, I feel, was shattering film patterns like left and right. I felt like I never knew what to expect. There's just weapons popping up from nowhere. There's like characters that are really fun one second, and then they turn frightening. We're snapping back and forth between memories. You don't know what's real and what's not. And I think that bathtub scene that I mentioned in the plot point, it perfectly illustrates this. So Dr. Gonzo, if you don't recall this scene, Dr. Gonzo is scary because he's got a fucking hunting knife and he's a big dude and he's screaming, but he's like also this pathetic, guy soaking in his tidy whities, and he's being held at bay with a shower rod, which is like simultaneously hilarious and upsetting. Then there's this ridiculous request for Duke to throw the tape recorder into the bathwater, which could kill him, obviously, because it's plugged into the fucking, wall. But you're also kind of thinking like, fuck yeah, that would be kind of rad to get zapped through the wall to like Jefferson Airplane right in that. And everybody knows White Rabbit when it peaks. Like, it's a funny thought.
It is. And I don't want this to be a PSA for why you should try drugs. So kids, kids, do not do drugs. But I'm going to be honest and speak from my experience. Doing all these drugs for the window of time I did, I think made me who I am today. They do cause you to think differently. The experiences that you go through, it changes your perception. And I think it definitely broadened my mind and changed the creative aspects of my life. And I think it made me who I was. And I don't regret it. And I see a lot of my experiences in the way the movie visualized hallucinating. Most movies you see, it's like Natural Born Killers. It's like, oh, let's do crazy colors. And the background is screening and just kind of spinning by. And it's a lot of wild, fast camera movements. Fear and Loathing tries some simple things that I had never seen before. Like when they go in the hotel room and they're watching the television and it's about the war. And they have just these shadows of the bombers going over the carpet and on the wall. It's a lot of very subtle ways that they demonstrate tripping, because tripping isn't always iguanas and people getting eaten and then the floor melting. A lot of times it was just simple patterns blending and a lot of connections between things that you never perceived before. So I like the subtle ways that they demonstrate it, because most movies don't do that.
Yeah, I think the most accurate portrayal and the best portrayal of tripping in a movie, I don't know if you guys have seen Midsummer that came out last year, but basically when they're tripping in that movie, everything's so vivid and breathing, like even like the flowers are look like they're breathing. And I could totally deal with that. I mean, I think that looks nice. And of course in that movie, minus the human sacrifice in that movie. But here, the stuff they do where it is subtle is great, but that shit that's like very like Beetlejuice at like the check-in where she's turning into the eel and stuff like that looks like a fucking nightmare. And the circus scene really kind of takes that to like the nth degree. I can't imagine a worse place to be fucked up than at a circus. I think already just being stone cold sober at a circus, it's a really weird sensory overload. There in Disney World, I think would be the worst places to be high. Now, granted, mescaline that they're using is smoother than LSD, but still, I wouldn't want to do it. But I do think that this part of the movie works really well. And, when he's talking about the Sixth Reich, that voiceover over this entire scene, it's hilarious and it's really intoxicating. And that's where you start to realize that what they're doing with this movie is they're simulating what it's like to be high while you're watching. Like you're intoxicated by what you're seeing on the screen, just like the drugs would make you. And it just made me want to take a shit ton of mescaline with, Duke and Gonzo and just enjoy their fucking brains for a second.
In our coverage, Ash, of Lovecraft Country, King B on episode 1's deep dive was talking about the James Baldwin voiceover in that episode. And he says, I wasn't really like listening to it. I kind of know what the idea is here. And this is where that sort of movie watching experience can go horribly wrong. You have to listen to the narration to understand what's going on screen. And you mentioned that circus scene, that the Bazooka Circus Casino, the circus is this grotesque manifestation of capitalism. You're gathering wild animals and human anomalies and dangerous feats and risking your life to make a buck. And Hunter S. Thompson is saying while they're at this revolving bar in the middle of the circus, he's like, we've hit the nerve center, while we're drinking at this carousel bar. And it seems goofy, but it's a momentarily perfect marriage of film and narration that helps the viewer understand Thompson and the drugs. And I was like, shit, like, I get it. This was the moment where it hit home for me that this is an incredibly intelligent film.
And they do blend in some things that aren't necessarily real, but they're very subtle. As the carousel's going around, which is a fucking terrible idea for a bar. Terrible. Besides just the lawsuits, I'd get dizzy. I think getting drunk and being in that carousel wouldn't be a good idea. But they're walking by all of these booths, like to pop a balloon, to win a prize. And there's like some that are like, there's a KKK guy running the booth. There's the talking ape or whatever. So you don't know what's always real. And it's causing me stress. I'm feeling like the walls are closing in on me. Like you can't even walk. And I don't know if it was my experiences with it or whatever, but this point in the movie, it is like sensory overload and I'm feeling stressed out. And it reminded me of when I was doing drugs. I had 3 simple rules that I lived by. Anytime I was going to trip out, I said, okay, number 1, I have to enjoy everyone in the group. So normally if it's 3, 4, 2 people that you're going to drop with, you have to like everyone because everything will be hypersensitive. If you like the person, you'll love the person. If you hate the person, every little thing they do that you hate will just be amplified. Number 2, you have to be wearing comfortable clothes. If you're hot, if you're cold, if something is restrictive, it will just grate on you like a little pebble in your shoe. So you got to be comfortable. And then also for me, because I'm a bit obsessive compulsive, I couldn't have anything that I had to be at for like at least 12 hours. Because otherwise I was worried. I had like, oh, how long were we tripping? How long were we? So I have to go. I couldn't do that. And Gonzo clearly violates fucking rule number 1. I had friends like that who you could not trust, who when they tripped out, they became a danger to themselves. They became a danger to everyone else. And you just can't do it. The second he pulls out that knife, there's no way I'm going out with Gonzo. Somebody's going to get hurt.
Well, and I think Johnny Depp does a good job of kind of balancing, the performance of Benicio Del Toro, because Benicio Del Toro gets so crazy in this part of the movie. I think that he at least has come down a little bit. But I do want to say one negative thing, and I know this is going to be an incredibly unpopular opinion, but while I think that Johnny Depp's voiceovers are great, I was really distracted by him in certain parts of the movie. I think that he's still just way too pretty to be playing Hunter S. Thompson. And even though he's wearing those, what do they call them? Acapulco shirts. Like, even though he's wearing the Acapulco shirts and he looks ridiculous, he still looks like a really hot movie star that has like a bad haircut and is just wearing weird glasses. And apparently I'm not alone in this. There apparently is a lot of criticism out there of the fact that Johnny Depp may have been a bit too pretty to play the role. And I know he's played other weird roles like Edward Scissorhands and all that, but he's hot in Edward Scissorhands. And I think he still like has that attractiveness here. And you mentioned Jack Nicholson. I think a younger Jack Nicholson maybe would have been better in terms of putting like the physicality to Thompson. Voiceover's perfect, but I started to kind of see through the facade in this part of the film and just question whether or not Johnny Depp's look, whether he was, too sexy to play Hunter S. Thompson.
I can always appreciate a movie that's self-aware. I thought there was a joke in that Johnny Depp was Hunter S. Thompson's self-view, because he sees himself in that San Francisco flashback, and that actually is Hunter S. Thompson, and he comments on his own rough appearance, and it's actually him from years before, So I think that, I don't know, I took that as like a joke. It gave me a chuckle because I was like, yeah, Johnny Depp's a good-looking dude. Oh, okay, they're aware of that. They're making fun of it. But pretty or not, the way Johnny Depp delivers lines, like when he gives Dr. Gonzo his drugs for his heart condition, and then he's like, "Now for the doctor." The way he moves on screen with that typewriter, who's going to do that? I think the physicality was absolutely perfect, and the voice work was perfect as well.
And it made me sad. Johnny Depp was special. You think about now Captain Jack Sparrow, he has become a caricature of himself. This Johnny Depp was a different dude. Amazing performance.
And speaking of that scene where Hunter S. Thompson sees himself, there is this kind of a trough in the movie where it slows down a little bit. It gets a little bit dim. And we see these San Francisco flashback scenes. And some people who watch these scenes might be like, oh, well, this part of the movie is not very fun. It's kind of slowing down. But I am so glad we got this change of pace around halfway through the movie. It's right about the 1 hour mark. It's the closest thing we get to meaning in any of this. We realize that at this point that we're caught in this tidal pool. There was a wave that started years before in the 60s in San Francisco, and it kind of splashed over the country. And Hunter S. Thompson, Duke, he is stuck in this tidal pool. And what he's realizing is, as bad as it is, as displaced as he feels, as trippy as all this is, like, he's better off being in the tidal pool of that drug crazed wave than where a square might be. And there's this funny, what seems like a throwaway scene where a dude's like licking LSD off of his sleeve, but really re-examine that scene. Is my favorite scene in the movie. He's wearing that red flannel shirt, and this guy walks in and sees this crazed hippie like licking the LSD off his sleeve. And what Hunter S. Thompson says is, this guy now lived with a fear of bathrooms, creating men in red flannel shirts getting kicks he'd never understand. And I was like, that's our fucking lives. That's something that I can relate to, is that no matter how fucking lame and depressing my life gets, maybe I die alone, who knows? It's like, I tasted those heights. I know what those moments are like, and other people go through life never experiencing them.
You mean Flea licking his sleeve?
Yeah, Flea.
Another cameo we missed.
And I think that you need this kind of slowdown too, because if the movie is doing this brilliant thing where they're showing, the highs and lows of drug trips, like, you have to, if you're on a bender, like, eventually you come down in order to get high again. And so I think that's this point of the movie. You have Duke, who is literally come down. And so then the movie pace comes down with him, and you appreciate that, to have that breath in that moment before that next high. And that's what I think that Gilliam and the performances they give us here.
Well, the next morning, Duke finds no sign of Gonzo, who has returned to LA while Duke slept, and Duke attempts to leave town. As he nears Baker, California, a patrolman stops him for speeding and advises him to sleep at a nearby rest stop. Duke instead heads to a payphone and calls Gonzo, learning that he has a suite in his name at the Flamingo, Las Vegas, so he can cover a district attorney's convention on narcotics. Duke checks into his suite only to be met by an LSD tripping Gonzo and a young girl called Lucy, who Gonzo explains has come to Las Vegas to meet Barbra Streisand. Duke convinces Gonzo to ditch Lucy in another hotel before her acid trip wears off. So the minute that Duke walks into this suite at the Flamingo, it all clicked for me. Guys, I have spent my entire life despising color, despising patterns. My world is a Joy Division world where everything is black and white and minimalist. And as a result, I've always hated Las Vegas. I've always hated Hollywood. They were so garish and artificial and just insistent about happy, 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 bright colors, you know? Fear and Loathing really changed that for me. And I found myself asking, shit, man, like you're only alive once. Why not indulge at every opportunities? The 70s made a lot of sense, and the 60s as well. Why have white walls when you can have pink textured walls? Why have black shirts when you can have wild ass patterns? Why the fuck are we not walking around on shag carpeting every fucking day? The 1971 Hollywood and Las Vegas here, they embrace the weird and the decadent, like Holly weird, right? It was like, it was cool to be weird and outlandish and nuts. And in 1971 Vegas, even the mainstream square people are cooler than I am today. I just want to go there.
I don't know if they inspired me to change my decor as much as they made me laugh. I mean, I thought that all of that was so funny, from the costumes to the decorations. And we talked a little bit about funny moments, but a lot of people who don't like this film, they think it's just a wholly unfunny film. And I think that that's a huge misconception, because I think this movie is actually really hilarious. And Hunter S. Thompson in general is just really funny. And I think a lot of that, it kind of has to do with the way that it's shot, and that there's not a lot of downtime to take those breaths that we're used to taking in order to understand comedy. And I found this review by Roger Ebert, who said about the film, he said, humor depends on attitude. Beyond a certain point, you don't have an attitude, you simply inhabit a state. And I think that people see this part of the movie and it seems like a lot of repetition, like, oh, they're getting high again. Oh, Gonzo's being crazy again. But I think there's more to it than that, because that's what, if you've not used drugs before, especially not just use them recreationally, but use them like in an addict way, like these two guys who are addicts do, it is repetition. It's repetition over and over and over again. I mean, you know, when Tom relapsed, he would go out for 4 and 5 hours looking for drugs, and then he would come home, spend the rest of the night using them, and then go to work high the next day, so he'd have enough money to go back out and start the whole, you know, process over again. And there's this monotony to it that he's stuck in and that I was stuck in. And there's a humor to the absurdity of that you keep putting yourself through that same process. And so I think it's kind of unfair when people complain about the constant repetition beginning with this part of the movie, because I think it actually is a movie that shows a real life portrayal of an addict and a consummate drug user, and the monotony to that.
Ash, the way you describe it, it makes me think of like a roller coaster, right? So a roller coaster might be thrilling. It's got its peaks and it's got its drops and it's got its twists and its turns. But if your entire life was just on that same roller coaster, where it's climb, 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 and then go through the ride again, it starts to drag. If you're on a roller coaster every day, it's now your new routine, right? And I do think at this point, it's almost intentional that the movie starts to almost skid on its own ass for a bit. And I know we talked about the garbage cameos in this movie, but Christina Ricci is about as perfect as it gets, in my opinion, for a Streisand painting church girl who arrived in Vegas unprepared for this predator that's, you know, feeding her drugs. And I mean, I guess you could have cast Juliette Lewis too, but that's just Juliette Lewis all the time. I couldn't tell if this movie wanted me to laugh, but Duke's reaction to the situation makes me believe that we were supposed to feel sick. Like, he forces Dr. Gonzo to push the narrative of like, what were you planning on doing to this girl, and how would this end out? You know, are we going to pimp her out to these cops? Like, what are we going to do to her? And granted, I admittedly laughed at Gonzo repeatedly going, that's and like waving him off. But Gilliam here isn't trying to create these characters we love or like sympathetic characters. It's not wholly irresponsible. I think he wants us to keep them, you know, at arm's length. And that's repeated in that diner scene, and also the way that like Duke and Gonzo attack, the housekeeper. They're very violent toward women, and I appreciate that there was this seriousness paid to the film.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think when you're in this type of world, when you're in that community, the people who party and the people who are high all the times, there's a lot of times you come across damaged people. I remember going to Mardi Gras, and we met a girl who had been separated from her friends, and I could sense right away that she was like walking around like a deer in the headlights. She was a victim waiting to happen. So I was like, hey, come on, come hang out with us. She ended up hanging out with us for the week. She actually got in our minivan and drove back to New York with us when she wasn't from there. And a lot of people aren't that lucky. So I like the fact, because I was worried here at this point, if Duke had been on board with what he was doing, and I know it happens, but it's just a sad truth. And I think they had to show that, because if everything in here was rainbows and unicorns, you'd call bullshit. It wouldn't be genuine and honest to what goes on in a lot of these people's lives.
Well, Gonzo accompanies Duke to the convention, and the pair discreetly snort cocaine as the guest speaker delivers a speech about marijuana addicts before showing a brief film. Duke and Gonzo flee back to their room, only to discover that Lucy has called. With their trips almost over, Gonzo deals with Lucy over the phone, pretending that he's being savagely beaten by intruders, as Duke attempts to mellow out by trying some of Gonzo's stash of adrenochrome. However, the trip spirals out of control, and Duke is reduced to an incoherent mess before he blacks out.
So, Ash, I have to differ with you. Earlier on, you're like, oh, I guess that's my Ashley voice officially now, where it's like, oh, okay. So you're like, well, I like the repetitive, the drug use to show the cycle and routine of a drug addict. I have to disagree in this. There comes a point in this movie where it starts to drag. And it's not so much even just the drug use, get high, act crazy, pass out, drug use, and the constant fighting between Duke and Gonzo. And he's trying to talk Gonzo off of the ledge and get away a weapon and then leave the room and come back and the room is trash. And that repetitiveness started to drag on the movie. And when Gonzo disappears, I was like, we're back to it. Because I love watching them walking the streets, interacting with people. That's the fun part to me. The dark portions in the room, I needed to see it once or twice. When I started seeing it more and more, it just started dragging me down. I felt like I was starting to have a bad trip.
Yeah, but this gives us one of the greatest scenes from the entire movie when he goes back to this hotel room and the adrenochrome, and he takes the adrenochrome, which is not a real drug. Oh. I was like, is this a real thing? And it's God. Not. Apparently, Hunter S. Thompson made it up for his book, and the director wanted to keep it in the film. And Thompson based it, so it is actually a drug. It's just not a hallucinogen. So adrenochrome is based off of this product of adrenaline and this other substance, and it's basically used to reduce bleeding of the capillaries, whatever that means. But neither one of those things act as a hallucinogen in the way that they portray it here. And I do think it's hilarious. I mean, the way that they shoot Johnny Depp and his face like subtly morphing into other things, it's fucking terrifying but amazing. But what I love is that through the years, Terry Gilliam and Johnny Depp both have talked about how young guys will like approach them in the street and be like, oh man, that scene on the adrenochrome, it was so accurate, man. It was just like that when I used it. And they said that they never have the heart to tell them that it's not a real thing. So they know that they're lying about it. But I wish it were a real substance, because it absolutely cracked me up the way that they use, the way that it has the little Alice in Wonderland drink me label on it. I mean, all of that was just absolutely perfect.
Well, after taking the adrenochrome, Duke wakes up to a complete ruin of the once pristine suite. After discovering his tape recorder, he has brief memories of the general mayhem that has taken place, including a heated encounter with a waitress at a diner, convincing a distraught cleaning woman that they are police officers investigating a drug ring, and attempting to buy an orangutan. Duke drops Gonzo off at the airport before returning to the hotel one last time to finish his article. He then speeds back to Los Angeles.
Okay, so this is the part of the movie where we get a hangover type blackout where you don't remember what happened. You got to piece the night back together. And I only really had one of these genuine nights that I had no idea and had to try to piece it back together. Normally I could figure it out, but one of my guilty vices, I like reality TV. I've always been a fan of Big Brother and Survivor. So in Celebration, Florida, right down the road, every summer, I think it's in August, there's a charity called Hearts of Reality. And it's a children's charity for kids with heart defects. So they bring in all of the reality stars, in quotation, like The Bachelor, all the different like survival shows, Big Brother. And what they do is they do a whole weekend of events, but the only one I usually go to is the bar night. So Cole Pitcock, who guest starred with us on one of our episodes, Big Trouble in Little China, he's a huge Big Brother fan too. So we go out there with my wife, Vanessa, her sister, and we proceed to start drinking. And we're drinking pretty heavily. A lot of drinks. We're having fun. We're dancing. If people out there know Survivor, like Russell Hantz, who's like supposedly the best survivor, he's there with the guys from MTV's Road Rules. Cole Pitcock almost gets into a fight with Dan from MTV, Dan Cortez, and it was just a fucking wild night. Fast forward now to the next morning. I wake up. It's like 10 a.m. I'm naked on the couch. No pants, no cell phone, no wallet, no wife. Mm-hmm. And I'm in pain. So I'm like, okay, how do I piece this together? I go to get something to drink because I felt like I was going to pass out. I open up the trash can. In the trash can are my pants covered in vomit with my keys in it. So now I'm like, okay, there's my keys. So then I get dressed. I go downstairs and my car is gone, but my wife's is there. So I'm like, okay, next part of the mystery. Her windows are cracked. I open the door. There's my phone and the car is covered in vomit. So I'm like, oh shit. So now I know the vomit was on me. It's on the car. It had to have been me. Needless to say, I call Vanessa with my phone and she says, I will be home in 7 hours and that car will be clean. So now I'm still in my head piecing it back together. And what turned out happening was we drank so bad that I thought somebody had roofied us. We started to like hallucinate. Cole Pitcock knocked over the hostess stand, which broke, cut his foot open. He started bleeding all over the place. I ended up dragging him to the car. She tried to drive him home. We were both incoherent, couldn't give her directions. So then I roll the window down, puke out the window. It gets sucked back in the back window and sprays the roof of the car. She finally calls Cole Pitcock's roommate and says, hey, you have to give me directions. I don't know where you are. We pull up. He fireman carries Cole Pitcock into the house. I pass out. She drags me upstairs. I strip naked at some point, and that was how I got there. So I know it's a long story, but fuck, thank God I only had one of those.
I wish I only had one. I mean, I feel like 10 Mardi Gras in a row. I had in my 20s, I had one of these blackout nights. And I don't know about y'all, but I am really grateful that I was part of the last generation before social media like really became a thing. Because God help me if there was like Snapchat and Instagram where you could go back and look at like documentation of my terrible choices. Because all I had to worry about was that somebody had a disposable camera that hopefully got lost during the, events of the night. So like there was never even any pictures of it. But I mean, I was really bad about, I'm a cheap drunk, like total cheap drunk. I mean, I can drink a lot, but I get drunk quick. If you join us on Shappy Hour, you are familiar with that after one drink or two drinks, Ashley is gone. And so I've had many a blackout night and can relate there. Although I have never woken up naked in bed with my pants covered in vomit. Maybe naked in bed, but no vomit involved.
The pants were in the trash can. They were in the trash
exactly.
can. So I had that much sense.
Yeah.
Well, the night is young. But Ash, you mentioned, there being no social media, no documentation of the things that happened, in our youth. But in this movie, we have these like objects that keep popping up throughout the movie. And I love the way that they're used in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. So you got the tape recorder, the knife, the handgun, the cars, all these like inanimate objects get an uncommon amount of screen time. In a movie where everything's happening at a frantic pace, they use these as like touch points. These artifacts are like stable points in the film. And they're, in a way, they're waypoints in an addict's life and like in a dreamer's waking moments. Duke says as he's leaving the room during one of Gonzo's trips that you can turn your back on a person, but never turn your back on a drug. And I feel like in its 2-hour span, this movie makes people seem like the imaginary thing and objects seem completely concrete. I felt like in every object that was presented on screen, like it was its own character. I knew the weight and the texture and the smell of everything I saw. And so I really appreciated the way the director used the set and the props to kind of like ground us and give us ideas of what was real and what wasn't in a world that was swirling the whole time.
And the thing about this movie that it does, I think, really well is it makes you uncomfortable. It makes you feel what it's like to either be high, tripping out, or to live that kind of life. When we get into that hotel room, when he wakes up and it is trashed, I felt uncomfortable. My skin was crawling. There's water and he's slopping around in those galoshes with his like the tail on, and there's shit on the wall that you don't know. Is this feces? Is this ketchup? Is this mustard? Is that load shot all over those pictures, or is it dried yellow mustard? You don't know. I'm physically uncomfortable watching this scene. I want the movie to end. And I don't know if it's because I'd had a past doing drugs, but I felt like the walls were closing in on me. And I don't want to be dramatic, but this was a difficult one to get through.
Well, I think you're supposed to feel that way. And nothing is grosser than that vomit-covered car that's in that one clip at the end where he's remembering what happened. And so you see Gonzo and Duke, they're riding in this car, they're crying, they're coming down. And it's so great because they're juxtaposed with that other car with like the really pristine 3 people in it that are stone cold sober, so disgusted looking over at them. But, you know, Gene, earlier you talked about how in the San Francisco flashback, that's when things like clicked for you. This was the moment that things clicked for me, because you've got these 2 groups of people here that are in a completely artificial place of Las Vegas, but they both want to partake in that artificialness. They want to partake in those sins, with one group of Duke and Gonzo embracing those sins, and this other group pretending like they're not, pretending they're better because they didn't go quite as far. And I think what you're seeing here is you've got this dying world of the 1960s hippie culture meeting the world of the mainstream of the 70s, and this oncoming sanitation that's going to come with the 1980s. And it's this really violent clash that's summed up in a car that's covered in vomit. It's soaked in tears. It's absolutely splattered with chemicals. Like, I went, oh my God. This is the theme of the movie. And if you combine that with that diner scene, it's done. It's hilarious. It's smart. It's funny. And I realized right there why this is a Criterion Collection movie, why it's at the top of so many people's best movie list, because it's amazing and smart. And this scene really, as gross as it was, it really blew me away.
You know, Ash, if you look this up on Rotten Tomatoes, it's got horrible reviews from critics. And I think viewers are a little more fond of it. And I don't know if people actually get the whole movie. It's just entertaining kind of on a superficial level. But I do wish I could just drive over there right now and hug you for understanding this in the same way that I do. Because I watched that same scene and I was like, I don't know if everyone understands the world in the same way I do. I feel a little less alone when I hear things like that, because there's this beauty in the tragic and ugly death throes of dreams. When you're watching something die in a movie, it is some of the most powerful things you can see, whether you want it to happen or not. And there's these guys that we were laughing at and loving life with and just watching romp around Vegas. And then you see what's evading them, you know, and again, Del Toro, like, yes, it's gross. He's vomiting all over the car, but really look at him and look at what's being expressed there. This is acting. Like, this is film, and it's really brilliantly done. And I can't emphasize how much I appreciate the fact that you saw that too. So no pressure, but we're getting to the Shat scores now. So the Shat score is our way of saying how many wipes this movie would take to get off of your butt. 0 wipes is a perfect movie. It is an adrenochrome trip into the stars, and 5 wipes as Dr. Gonzo vomiting into a toilet while the room fills up with water. Big D, we'll start with you. What is your wipe score for Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas?
So I think it's not a surprise that Terry Gilliam, one of his shortcomings as a director is that he really does not know how to edit himself. He likes to just film everything. His movies are long. And longer doesn't always mean better for me. I think this movie is far too long at 2 hours and self-indulgent. By the end, both characters are unlikable. They're unbearable to me. I kept wishing the movie would end. And the first half I thought was beautiful. I thought it was really conveying the message. Somewhere in the middle, it lost its way. That doesn't change the fact. The acting, I think, is probably some of the best that we've seen in a while across the board. Benicio, that dude's a beast. So for me, it is a great movie, but I think it falls far shorter than it could have been. This is, I think, a one-wipe movie if you trim it down a bit. But again, maybe they were trying to make us feel that arduous, just drawn-out, suffering journey of an addict. But for me in the audience, I was just like, man, I want this to fucking end. I want to go take a shower. I need to get this stink off of my body. So for that, it is a two-wipe movie.
I want to preface my score by saying that I don't think that any movie will ever do Hunter S. Thompson's work justice. He was an absolutely brilliant writer. But I do think, though, that this movie is going to be the closest we come to that. I think that Thompson was this actor of his own kind. He made theater through his writing. And while it is impossible to truly embody those ideas or his persona, this movie gets pretty damn close. But at the same time, I do understand why it's hated. Like you're saying, Big D, it's hard to watch in places. It's really dizzying in the way that it's presented. But I think all of that is intentional and makes sense and works for me. So I also understand very much why it's loved. And those are some of the reasons why I loved it. I think it by far is one of the most real portrayals of the way that addicts use in terms of this constant re-upping, and also the fact that there's this between addicts starting to use and ending up in a gutter, like a Requiem situation. Like there's an in-between there where they're like walking through the world in these literal altered states. And I appreciated that. Now, of course, they show none of the real consequences that Thompson himself experienced from using, what happened after the fact. So I do still stand by the fact that movies like Trainspotting or Permanent Midnight, even Basketball Diaries, are better quote unquote drug movies. But I don't think Hunter S. Thompson intended this to be just a drug story. It's a really brilliant tale that drugs are used as a means to tell the story. And so with all that in mind, I'm going to give it 1.25 wipes.
All right. So that's 2 wipes from Big D, 1.25 wipes for Ash. Guys, Andrew Johnston, who is a writer for Time Out New York, said that Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas is really a Rorschach test of a movie, that some people would see a god-awful mess that was rendered inaccessible by the stumbling handheld camera and Depp's nearly incomprehensible narration, and others would see a freewheeling comedy, a thinking person's Cheech and Chong film. Now, I'd go a step further and say that this is a thinking person's Dumb and Dumber. A movie that I really love. You got 2 sort of friends. They got this briefcase. There's a road trip. There's misbehaving. There's discovering a new town. And what I loved about Fear and Loathing is, unlike Dumb and Dumber, I never saw these jokes coming. Sometimes the comedy came from an unexpected combination of words, like that's one thing that's good for you, peanuts. And sometimes it was just the way someone moved or spoke or looked. And that's the meat of the movie. But then there's this special layer on top of that. That little special something is, as you mentioned, Ash, this pervasive sadness in watching a dream die. Duke, as he's watching Dr. Gonzo fly off in the plane, he says that he was something too weird to live and too rare to die. And I think the movie examines that thing. Big D, I do agree with you, though. There is this small shit streak that we do have to wipe away. It's 1 wipe for being a touch too repetitive, also using the world's worst bald cap, and involving a few cameos that just weren't needed. I agree. They distracted us from the fun that we were having with the movie. And so for all that, I give it 1 wipe. So my 1 wipe, Ash's 1.25 wipes, and Big D's 2 wipes, that comes to an average wipe score of 1.416 repeating wipes for Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas.
So with that score, that now puts it in the 53 spot. It is slightly better than The Thing, Scrooged, and Friday the 13th. And it is slightly worse than last week's movie, The Mummy, Total Recall, The Last Action Hero, and The Matrix. So it's in that zone, 50 out of, let's say, 178. So it is in the top third. I don't think it's too bad.
No, it's not bad at all.
Mm-mm.
No complaints here.
All right, Big D, what do we have coming up next week?
Man, so next week we have a commission by Patrick A. And this movie, I think a lot of people are going to love this. everyone has memories of it, but I haven't seen it in probably 20 years, and I'm a little afraid to see what it's going to be. But it tells the story of John, a distinguished British gentleman, employs downtrodden youth to tend his herd in his New Mexico frontier. When John is gunned down by a crooked Lawrence G. Murphy, a ragtag group of cowhands, including Doc Sherlock, Richard Brewer, and a young William Billy the Kid, ride forth in search of blood vengeance for the death of their beloved mentors. Commissioned by Patrick A., it was released in August of 1988. It had a box office receipts of $46 million US. Its awards were the Bronze Wrangler for theatrical motion pictures. And there's some songs in here by some 80s stars that everybody will know. I think there's a Bon Jovi song, but...
Well, I'm excited to reap the whirlwind with you guys. But thank you, Kip.
Regulators! Mount up!
Thank you, Kip, for your commission. And thank everyone who's commissioned a film in the past and those films that are coming up. If you'd like to commission a film, you can write to us at host@shatthemovies.com or visit our website, shatthemovies.com. That concludes this week's episode of Shat the Movies. Be sure to follow us on social media and share with a friend. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, and Instagram at Shat the Movies. You can support the podcast by shopping our Amazon affiliate link, completing a free anonymous survey to help attract advertisers, buying our merch, or, as I mentioned, commissioning your own movie. You can find all that information at shatthemovies.com. Also, you can check out our sister podcast, Shat on TV, where we review TV series such as Lovecraft Country, Westworld, True Detective, Taboo, American Gods, Game of Thrones, and Watchmen. You can find all that information on our website, shatontv.com, and wherever fine podcasts can be found, including iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe, and if you stop by iTunes, please leave a review. That helps the podcast grow. On behalf of my co-hosts, Big D, Dick Ebert, Ashley Schlafly, and the King Bee, I'm Gene Lyons. Be sure to join us next week for the following film.
6 reasons why the West was wild.
No one's fool enough to go in after Murphy's people.
Emilio Estevez.
I'm in.
Deputize them. Kiefer Sutherland.
You look like trouble.
Trouble? You think I look like trouble? I'm a poet. McSween, those are just boys. Ain't one of them over 21. Murphy's men will shred them in half within a day.
Casey Shimashko.
I'm a pugilist.
You son of a...
Court adjourned.
Dermot Mulroney.
He ain't all there, is he?
Lou Diamond Phillips.
My vision told me we're headed for blood.
Charlie Sheen.
We got warrants! We're the law!
You were supposed to serve 11 warrants and expose the ring. Instead, you went out and you went on the warpath.
The governor's revoked your deputization powers. You're now wanted by the legitimate law as well as those outside the law.
You're being hunted by troops.
I like these odds.
Young Guns.